Yes, Ms. Seegers.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
General, we were at paragraph 32 of your statement on page 11, and I had interrupted you when you were dealing with the 5 arrested suspects. If you can continue from there.
Thank you, Commissioners. Of the 5 suspects, 3 were Mexican nationals and 2 were South African nationals. I mention this because it's well known within the illicit drug manufacturing space that Mexican nationals tend to be the best at manufacturing synthetic drugs or at being cooks within that space. Individuals who are responsible for the preparation or manufacture of drugs, including the combining and processing of chemicals to produce the final substance, are referred to as cooks. They are the people making the drugs, not just handling or selling. Synthetic drugs are manufactured primarily for the local market, but may also be sold to markets beyond the border. Since synthetic drugs can be made in the country with chemicals available in the country, it is very rare that synthetic drugs to be imported to the country. However, in February 2020, there was a seizure of 547 kilograms of Mandrax in Durban at the CHC depot. Manufacturers of synthetic drugs, superlab manufacturers, do not confine themselves to the synthetic drug trade. They are likely also involved in the trafficking of cocaine and heroin and other substances.
General, because we're going to move on to a new topic, can I just understand what is the relevance of the February 2020 bust of Mandrax? You're saying that it is a rare occurrence for there to be Mandrax imported into the country because it can be made here. Is that the point that you're making?
That's correct, Commissioners.
And what happened to the 547 kilograms of Mandrax, you know?
Well, the Mandrax was booked into the SAP 13 at Isipingo police station, and the relevance of the referral to this, Commissioners, will be attended to later on in my evidence.
Thank you, General. And then just clarity on paragraph 34. Essentially what you're saying is that the people that have super labs and that manufacture the synthetic drugs don't necessarily just stay within that lane. They can also be involved in the trafficking of cocaine, the distribution of cocaine and heroin. So they could also be recipients of imported cocaine or heroin.
Indeed, Commissioners, these criminals do not confine themselves just to one commodity. It depends on their market and their distribution networks and what's the need for or what is required by the market. Will obviously depend what they keep themselves busy with.
And then insofar as the markets are concerned, can you just tell us when we're talking about the value of or how expensive the drugs are, what are we talking about? So cocaine versus the synthetic drugs, for example.
Well, obviously cocaine is the most expensive drug of it all, Commissioners. And then these days the preferred drug, in addition to cocaine, is methamphetamine. To a lesser extent, but at a lower level, you will find extensive use of Mandrax, especially in poorer communities, due to the fact that it's less expensive.
And the cocaine, are we just talking about pure cocaine, or is there a process that's involved in the cocaine as well?
Well, Commissioners, obviously criminals will forever remain criminals. And there's no honor between thieves. So especially within the cocaine trade, when the cocaine arrives here, it is fairly pure in nature. But then the cocaine gets cut, so it gets mixed with other substances so that they expand on the volume that can be distributed into the market by still selling it off at the price that they intend to sell it off as being pure. So it's less purer, but still cocaine.
Okay, thanks, General. And
Before you move on to the next heading, General, with synthetic drugs, how prevalent is local production, and is there information that locates it per province, where you could say we have a big problem of the super labs, let's say, in a particular geographic area in the country, and kitchen labs in a different part of the country?
Thank you, Commissioners. Yes, the kitchen labs are throughout. There's no specific province or area that's least or more affected than another, because that's really for local distribution. When it comes to clandestine laboratories at the level of super labs, we have found that specifically Gauteng, Limpopo, Northwest, and Mpumalanga to a large extent are mostly affected. I'm not sure of the exact reasons for that, but I believe inter alia it speaks to the climate and a more drier climate than coastal provinces, which will make it easier for manufacturing purposes.
One assumes these are on the radar of law enforcement, and is that fight being won if they are on the radar of law enforcement?
Commissioner, indeed, it's a focus area not just of the DPCI, but of SAPS in general, because we are together against crime. And obviously it's a whole of government and a whole of community approach, where everybody that can assist to dismantle clandestine laboratories, we appreciate such information and operationalize it without delay. So it is a massive focus area of the DPCI and SAPS in general. And it's always difficult to say whether we are winning the war, but because these crimes are committed in secrecy, and you can only count what you have dismantled, so that makes it difficult. But indeed, there is an increase in the need for synthetic drugs, and that's the reason for the influx of Mexican nationals into South Africa.
One hears in popular media, if you like, or in public spaces, allegations about the involvement of police, that these kind of things carry on because there's protection from the police or involvement. Do you have any comment about that? What is your experience, and are you aware? You would be aware of these kind of allegations, and not to say they are correct or not, but do you have any comment about it?
Commissioners, I'm not aware of police involvement in any of the matters that crossed my table, with specific reference to clandestine drug laboratories. I'm not aware of police involvement, but it's highly possible. I cannot exclude it.
Let me be more specific. You, rightly or wrongly, there are parts in the country that are specifically mentioned to be hotspots. Some of them in Pretoria, some of them in Johannesburg. And the allegations in the public space are these are more trading than anything, than labs, it seems, that supply of drugs, maybe let me say, that happens under protection of police officers, and that is why even communities are unable to win when they try and fight that. I'm asking that kind of question.
Yes, Commissioner, I think it's very valid and a valid concern of community members. What I would plea is that if community members are aware of such, is to report that activities to higher levels within SAPS and the DPCI, and we will definitely give the necessary attention to it. And by means of criminal investigations and disciplinary investigations, ensure that we get rid of that rotten apples that are actively participating then in criminality within the narcotic trade.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. General, the Groblersdal super lab, was that the only super lab that you've been able to detect and dismantle?
No, by no means, Commissioners. On an annual basis, clandestine laboratories of different size and nature are detected within South Africa, approximately 20 per annum. And it shows us just the extent of the activities, but indeed it's a continuous process. So as we dismantle a clandestine laboratory, obviously there are more still in operation that we need to identify and then dismantle without delay.
And the Groblersdal matter, where is it now within the criminal justice process?
Commissioners, it came to my knowledge this morning that the matter is still before court, and there's a possibility of a plea and sentence agreement on the matter. It's postponed until later in May of this year for a decision on that matter.
Thank you, General. Can we then move on to the next topic on page 12, which is mandatory national instructions and protocol for the seizure of drugs? Can proceed from paragraph 35.
Thank you, Commissioners. The DPCI is mandated to address both CDLs where synthetic drugs are manufactured and the importing and exporting of drugs. Most seizures depend on intelligence either from informants or international law enforcement agencies, or when it's stumbled upon by port authorities. During a seizure operation, preserving the crime scene for further investigation and the gathering of evidence is crucial. It requires the involvement of various units, including members of the South African National Narcotic Enforcement Bureau, SANEP, detectives, crime intelligence, forensic experts from the Forensic Science Laboratory, local criminal record center, and the protection team to cordon off the scene. Crime scenes must be processed in accordance with National Instruction 1 of 2015, Crime Scene Management, to ensure the integrity of the scene and preserve the integrity of the evidence collected at the crime scene. Failure to do so will inevitably lead to the contamination of the crime scene, to the destruction or non-gathering of evidence, which will ultimately defeat the objective of a seizure operation and compromise subsequent criminal prosecutions. The 2015 National Instruction is based on international best practice. A copy is attached here to and marked as HFF 1.
And we'll get to it and deal with it in detail later. You can continue to paragraph 37.
The most important aspects of crime scene management at the drug seizure crime scene, whether at the CDL or elsewhere, such as the
Sorry,
harbour.
just a moment. Can this not be shown on the screen, please? Paragraph 37. We
Yeah.
talk to it, but can you just please not show it on the screen? Thanks.
Can continue.
The most important aspects of crime scene management at the drug seizure crime scene, whether at the CDL or elsewhere, such as the harbour, are the following. The crime scene must be cordoned off to ensure that no unauthorized individuals gain access to the scene. Ensure that the necessary role players are present or on standby. In a container drug bust, this would be at the minimum be the DPCI investigators, K9 Dog and LCRC, to collect evidence, including taking photographs of exhibits and of the scene processing procedures undertaken. FSL must be present at a CDL seizure but are not strictly required at any other drug bust unless the investigation team considers it necessary.
Can you just explain that, General? Why would they not be FSL? What is FSL? What division do they fall under? And why wouldn't they necessarily be at any other drug bust but CDL?
Commissioners, FSL is the Forensic Science Laboratory, and the reason why they are specifically called out to clandestine drug laboratories is because of the sophistication involved with those processes that's taking place there. For instance, they are specializing in the dismantling of these clan labs and the gathering of the necessary evidence from those scenes. It's very hazardous circumstances under which these drugs are manufactured. They have the necessary equipment to dismantle it. And then they must also take samples of an array of chemicals from those crime scenes. So it's rather complicated crime scenes, and it requires experts within that space. That compared to a normal seizure of narcotics in this instance now cocaine, from a container, you do not necessarily need that expertise. The local criminal record center investigators is more than adequate to deal with those crime scenes.
And under what division does the FSL fall under?
FSL falls within the detectives and forensic services under the divisional commissioner for that space. Currently, it is Major General Mogale is acting in the post, but the actual incumbent is Lieutenant General Sentumule, who's currently the Deputy National Commissioner, the acting Deputy National Commissioner for the Detective Service.
Thank you, General. Then on page 1437.3.
The crime scene investigator must keep proper record of the crime scene by means of contemporaneous notes. Photographs must be taken to illustrate the scene and to allow the chronological sequence of events. All exhibits must be examined for fingerprints and touch DNA, which are crucial in drug busts because of the clandestine nature of drug trafficking. Where drugs are stored in a container with legitimate cargo, there is usually no direct evidence of who or how the drugs are placed in the container. Fingerprints and DNA may be the only evidence that could ultimately link the drugs to the individuals who placed it in the container. All exhibits must be sealed in forensic seal bags with unique seal numbers before being removed from the crime scene. And once all these processes have been completed, the scene must be restored and handed back to the competent recipient. Exhibit management is equally important. Improper exhibit management.
Thank you. Sorry, I think that's fine. I was just concerned that you are disclosing what you do at the actual scene of the crime. And we just needed to be sensitive about that. But the process going forward, I think you can display.
Thank you, Commissioner Kumalo. I think we'll start when we deal with the new topic. It's fine. Thank you. You may proceed, General.
Thank you, Commissioners. Exhibit management is equally important. Improper exhibit management can be fatal to a successful prosecution. Exhibit management must be done in accordance with National Instruction 8 of 2017 and attached and marked as HFF2. Whilst all instructions are important, the most crucial in a drug seizure are the following. The exhibit must be handed in at the police station in the area where the exhibit was seized. All property and exhibits seized must be entered in the SAP 13 register of the relevant police station where the crime was committed or where the property was found and then transferred to the relevant unit and entered in the SAP 13 of the relevant unit. The SAP 13 registers of these units must be inspected regularly. All drugs, excluding Dagga and Kat, must be forwarded to FSL with immediate effect, but not later than 7 working days in exceptional circumstances for analysis and destruction, irrespective of whether a case docket has been registered or not. This includes all drugs found abandoned.
When you say all drugs, I know we're still going to be discussing the Port Shepstone, but other big busts as well. Sampling, where does it fit in? Where it's not the whole consignment that is taken to the laboratory, but only a portion of it. What regulates that?
Commissioners, under normal circumstances, there is no need to obtain samples at the crime scene. What is being done during cocaine seizures is that there is a presumptive test that is being done. So what that means is that the lead investigator or the crime scene manager would make a small hole in one of the bricks, obtain a small sample, then place that sample into a chemical basis, and that's the presumptive test. And if it colors blue, it means that indeed it's cocaine. So that's the only sampling that needs to be done at that point in time. In order to maintain the credibility of the crime scene, it's important, after all the necessary tests were conducted by our experts, to seal the exhibits there and then, because then you also maintain the chain of custody effectively so. So you've done your counting, you've done your photographs, the investigation to perhaps lift fingerprints or touch DNA from the exhibits. All those processes are completed. Then the exhibits must be sealed without delay on the crime scene. So there's no real need for investigators to obtain samples there, because in any event, the exhibits must be submitted to the Forensic Science Laboratory.
So General, what we see on TV where they test it with their tongue, that's not how it works in real life.
I will not advise that, Commissioner.
Thank you. General, why does it exclude Dagga and Kat?
Commissioners, Kat is a plant that's originating from North Africa. Obviously, and that plant needs to be submitted to FSL within a specific period, because otherwise it becomes rotten. So only samples are taken and then submitted to FSL. That's the only sampling. With Dagga, obviously, it means that when a cultivation facility is dismantled, you might sit with a whole warehouse full of Dagga. So it's just not practically possible to submit that whole consignment for analysis to the Forensic Science Laboratory. So it's all about practicality.
And the destruction process, how does that work, and how does one have certainty that there has been destruction of the seized drugs?
Commissioners, I do not have intimate knowledge of that process. It lies within the Forensic Science Laboratory space. But what I know is that upon completion of an investigation or a case docket, if it's finalized in court, we submit a document back to the Forensic Science Laboratory. It's called an SAP 83A, where we indicate that the narcotics can be destructed. The same applies to an inquiry investigation that's been closed, that there's no further leads. We also submit that SAP 83A, and then it's up to the Forensic Science Laboratory to destroy the narcotics that was seized.
And generally, what is the period that we're talking about where you don't have a criminal criminal prosecutions that follow the seizure?
Commissioners, it's very difficult to answer that question because it's being dealt with on a case-by-case scenario. So each case merits will determine how long it takes to complete the investigation. I think it goes back to proper command and control at unit level that will ensure that investigations are completed timeously, so that it can be driven to its logical conclusion, whether it is towards a criminal matter or whether the inquiry is then closed.
Just explain the difference between the criminal matter and the inquiry process. You seem to make a distinction between the two.
Commissioners, both methods are legitimate manners of investigation. Obviously, a case docket is not necessarily always court ready, but in investigations that needs further investigation before we will move towards to arrest accused and to prosecute them. It's better to investigate it in an inquiry and then complete the investigation, then convert it into a case docket and submit it for decision, or to secure then arrests and place it before court.
Thank you, General. And then paragraph 39.
Before you go to 39, typically what happens where there's a seizure, but there's no identified owners or recipients of that consignment, what happens? Is there an investigation, an inquiry, and in that process, what happens to the point where a decision is made to destroy those drugs?
Yeah, commissioners, in practice, those type of matters are dealt with predominantly under inquiries. The same processes needs to be followed. The exhibits must still find its way to FSL, where it's examined. You obtain your report from the experts, placed in the inquiry, obviously based on the merits, whether somebody or the consignment can be attributed to a person or entity. Then it will be converted into a case docket, and then the rest will follow. Otherwise, if there's no further leads, then the matter will be closed down and the notification be provided to the Forensic Science Laboratory for destruction. What I can perhaps also indicate is that it does not matter whether it is a case docket or an inquiry, but within this space, we are working hand in glove with the National Prosecuting Authority, and our investigations are prosecutor guided. So right from inception, the prosecution are assisting us. Obviously, we are working collaboratively so to ensure that the detectives, for instance, do not miss an important link in an investigation.
With that kind of explanation, would therefore be a record of an inquiry, if you like, or relating to the 30 July 2021 1,000 kilograms seizure and the Port Shepstone, the ones that end up getting lost. It's two different things, but would there be a record that indicates an inquiry was commenced and whatever steps were taken?
That's correct, Commissioner. There is a unique reference number that's allocated to each inquiry and case docket investigation, and it is available. It is electronically system driven, so it is available for forever. And then after the inquiry is closed down, obviously it's archived, but still available.
Thank you. And the drugs in that case would only be destroyed eventually when the inquiry is closed. Is that how it works?
That's correct, Commissioner. Obviously, upon submission of the SAP 83A, then the forensic science processes will kick in terms of the destruction of the exhibits.
Thank you, General.
Thank you. General, we were at, I think it's paragraph 39.
In addition to the aforementioned national instructions, a protocol on the search, seizure, handling, processing, and disposition of illicit drugs was adopted in October 2016 that must be complied with during the seizure of illicit drugs and the processes thereafter. The protocol is attached and marked as HHF 3. Importantly, the exhibit must be photographed by the crime scene examiner from LCRC or the forensic examiner from FSL. The photograph of the exhibit or item seized at the crime scene must be provided with a report issued by the crime scene examiner to the responsible investigating officer. I will now deal with the November 2021 theft of cocaine seized in June 2021. Before dealing with the theft, it is important to first deal with the seizure of the cocaine 4 months before the theft and highlight areas of serious concern that preceded the theft.
You may continue. So the next topic, June 2021, seizure of cocaine in Durban. Before you deal with the factual matrix, can you just explain to us your involvement in this matter, in the Port Shepstone matter?
Commissioners, as I've testified earlier, I only became involved in this matter after my appointment as the component head for serious organized crime investigation at head office after the departure of Major General Kana. So after I took up the position, obviously I engaged with the investigators on the matter, and that is how I became privy to the facts of this matter.
Okay, thank you, General. You may proceed.
Following intelligence received on 21 June 2021, a container that was at the CHC container depot in Isipingo, Prospecton, Durban, had been identified as possibly containing illicit drugs. The depot was called in order to retrieve the container for inspection. On 22 June 2021, Lieutenant Colonel Gavin Jacob, he has been subsequently promoted to Colonel, and Warrant Officer Mpangase from DPCI Serious Organized Crime Investigation. Commissioners, I just want to make a correction there. In brackets, it reflects border security at the time. That needs to be deleted. It's wrong. So that portion in brackets need to be deleted, please. So both these colleagues, both Jacob and Mpangase, they were based at the DPCI in Durban, were contacted and informed of the intelligence that had been received. They were requested to assist with conducting the inspection of the container, which allegedly had 27 kilograms of cocaine at the time. It was not 27 kilograms. It later emerged that it was 27 bags and not 27 kilograms. At approximately 9:20 on the same day, Colonel Jacob, Warrant Officers Mpangase and KG Sabia, by then, Lieutenant Colonel Sabia was a warrant officer, so he got promoted twice in the meantime.
And what is he now?
A Lieutenant Colonel KG Sabia. And the Crime Intelligence Officer, Captain Justice Jabulani Duma, went to the depot to conduct a search and seizure of the identified container. According to the official documentation obtained from the depot and the company, who had ordered the legitimate consignment in the container contained animal bone meal from a supplier in Brazil. The officers proceeded to break the seal of the container in the presence of Captain Duma, as well as the warehouse manager and Operational Response Services, ORS, Border Policing. According to the officers, prior to breaking the seal, a photo was taken to evidence that the seal was intact.
Thank you, General. At this stage, I'm just going to flight photo 1. And if you can just describe to us what we're looking at there.
Commissioners, that is a container, as I explained in some of the previous photos.
That's the container that the officers took a photograph of on the day.
That's correct, Commissioner.
And then photo 3. Sorry, before we get to photo 3, if we can do photo 2 first, because they mentioned the seal. At paragraph 42 of your statement, you say that according to the officers, prior to breaking the seal, a photo was taken to evidence that the seal was intact.
That is correct, Commissioner. That is the photo where the seal is clearly depicted.
And just remind us, what is the significance of the officers taking a photo of the seal before they're opening the container?
Commissioners, obviously it speaks to proper crime scene management, but also the chain of custody of the exhibits. It might be that nothing is found in the container and then it needs to be resealed. So obviously you need to follow due processes to ensure that good governance also dictate at that possible crime scene, because it's not a crime scene as yet when you are at the brink of opening the container.
Okay. 43, paragraph 43.
When the container was opened, numerous canvas bags were observed at the entrance of the container. The bags were inspected by the DPCI officers, and 27 bags containing what was suspected to be bricks of cocaine were uncovered. The bricks were wrapped in black and yellow plastic with TikTok and Jaguar logos on the packaging. There were 541 bricks of cocaine weighing 1 kilogram each, with a street value of between 200 and 250 million rand.
Thank you, General. Can we then put up photo 3? And you can just describe what it is that we're looking at.
Commissioners, that's a photo of the allegedly taken of the consignment that was found in the back of the container that also had the animal bone meal as part of the consignment.
In general, do you know if South Africa was their final destination or if they were en route to somewhere else?
No, it was the final destination, Commissioner.
So they were coming into our country?
That's correct, Commissioner.
And this information they obtained from the consignee.
That's correct. It is the bill of lading, the consignee, and all the paperwork associated to that, Commissioners.
And if you zoom into that photograph at the white bags is the animal bone meal.
That's correct, Commissioners. Commissioners, I think what's of importance here is that from the packaging where the cocaine is at the entrance to the container, it's clear that this is also an example of a rip-on, rip-off methodology that would have been applied here. So you need quick access to the drugs to remove it and obviously to get it away from the container as soon as possible.
And at paragraph 43, you then mentioned that it was wrapped in black and yellow plastic with TikTok and Jaguar logos. If we can show photo 4 and 5. Just zoom in a bit.
That is correct, Commissioners. As I've testified earlier, this is a clear example where you can see the fingerprint or the identity of the supplier with the different logos fixed to the bricks of cocaine. Obviously wrapped with multiple layers of wrapping to protect the contents of the brick.
And there you see the TikTok and the Jaguar.
That's correct. It's clearly visible, Commissioners.
Thank you, General. You may continue from there. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. General, presumably the law enforcement is able to identify or has identified who is Jaguar, who is TikTok, who does that W footprint or fingerprint belong to in terms of the owners of these drugs.
Commissioners, this is part of the evidence that I would prefer not to delve too deep into, because this is transnational smuggling of narcotics in nature, and this goes back to the origin of the cocaine that's being smuggled into South Africa. So I would prefer, with your permission, not to go too deep into that, because that forms part of bigger obviously transnational investigations that are continuing.
I wasn't asking you to name them. I just wanted to find out the principle that law enforcement is able to put their fingerprint to a particular group.
Indeed, Commissioner. Indeed. That's
Thank you.
true.
Thank you, General. Paragraph 44.
According to the officers at the crime scene, photographs of the seizure were taken by Lieutenant Colonel Jacob and Warrant Officer KG Sabia. The officers decided to convey the suspected cocaine to the Isipingo police station for a detailed count. According to the officers, the crime scene was becoming busy with warehouse staff. Colonel Jacob, Warrant Officer Mpangase, KG Sabia, and Sergeants Govender and Mkize loaded the canvas bags into a marked police vehicle.
General, Sergeants Govender and Mkize, are they also within DPCI?
No, Commissioners. They were from border policing based in Durban Harbour.
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
At the police station, Warrant Officer Mpangase entered the exhibits into the Isipingo SAP-13. Warrant Officer Perumal of the Isipingo police station responsible for the SAP-13 register acknowledged that the exhibits were entered into the SAP-13.
General, can you just explain that process to us, the SAP-13, how does it work? So they've got 541 bricks, kilograms of cocaine. How are they entering it into the SAP-13?
Well, Commissioners, the procedure is that the SAP-13 or the exhibit register during normal or 24-hour basis is kept in the community service center or the charge office as it's known. So whenever exhibits need to be entered, the official like Warrant Officer Mpangase then get hold of the register and then enter all the exhibits into that register and sign that he is handing that exhibits into the register. So he will have to give an full explanation of the exhibits that's being handed in, the exhibit seal numbers, the contents of the exhibits, etc. So there's a whole array of aspects that need to be covered when exhibits are entered into that register. Subsequent to that, the officer in command of the SAP 13, or commonly known as the SAP 13 clerk, will then acknowledge the exhibits, so he will sign for the exhibits and then place it in safe custody within the walk-in safes at that specific police station.
You mentioned an exhibit seal number. What is that?
Well, Commissioners, as I've explained a bit earlier, it's important to seal all exhibits as far as possible at the crime scene. In order to preserve the integrity of the crime, obviously the investigation, but also the chain of custody. So it means that the exhibits, the bricks of cocaine, need to be placed in, they call it intervoid or non-tamper evidence bags, and then it gets sealed, and each and every bag has a unique reference number. So all of that needs then to be entered into this register when the exhibits are deposed at the police station.
Now, at the time when these officers entered the exhibits into the SAP 13, did they have seal numbers, exhibit seal numbers?
No, Commissioners, because the exhibits was not sealed.
So what would they have entered into the SAP 13?
Commissioners, I can verify that from the entries, but they've just given an explanation of the exhibits that's being entered.
So just the description of it?
That's
not
correct,
without the
Commissioners.
number?
That's correct. There could have been no seal numbers because the exhibits was not sealed.
Okay, thank you.
General, does that mean then that maybe let me ask my question differently. Is there a way, given what you've just said now, explaining they were not sealed and so there were no seal numbers at that point, is there a way of independently, that you would independently have been able to verify that indeed it was 551 bricks of cocaine that were found in that container? And I'm talking about what happens from the time that that container is open up to this warrant officer Peruma, where they get to him and then ask for the SAP 13 register.
Yes, indeed, Commissioners. If proper crime scene notes or contemporaneous notes were kept by the lead investigator, obviously during that counting process it will be recorded either in a pocketbook or on foolscap. That's the first safeguard. Then obviously it gets placed in exhibit seal bag, sealed, and upon handing in at the police station, the SAP 13 clerk will obviously then verify what he or she is accepting. And then the third safeguard obviously will then be when the exhibits is received at the Forensic Science Laboratory. It is opened by the analysts and then obviously counted again, and that will be independent verification then for the initial claims by the investigators that it's 541 bricks.
None of that happened here. Those steps that you're describing.
That's correct, Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you, Commissioner. And then you mentioned non-tamper evidence bags. What is the purpose of it being non-tamper?
The importance of that, Commissioners, is that we preserve the integrity of the exhibits. So it means that whenever that exhibits arrive in that exhibit seal bags at FSL and it has been tampered with, it will be clearly visible. Whether the seal was, for instance, somebody tried to open it, or if somebody tried to cut the bag and then remove exhibits and then reseal it, that will be evidence. So there is scientific safeguards built into those exhibit bags that prevent tampering, obviously to the benefit of preserving the integrity of the exhibits.
Now, if the process is done correctly and it's in the non-tamper evidence bag, who is authorized to open the bags?
Well, it depends on where in the value chain that exhibit is, Commissioner. But under normal circumstances, it will obviously be at the forensic science laboratory, where the analyst that the matter is assigned to will open the exhibit bag. I cannot see another reason for reopening a bag and to remove exhibits from that without a good reason.
Assume that the process is followed correctly, and here you have the LCRC crime scene examiner bagging the evidence into these non-tamper bags at the crime scene. It goes to the to the police station. It's logged into the SAP 13 register, and then it's stored. Can somebody from FSL request that the investigating officer or somebody from LCRC open the bag in order to get a sample, for example?
Commissioners, if that happens, I will find it extremely strange, because the exhibits, according to the protocol, needs to be submitted to the forensic science laboratory for obviously the weighing of the exhibits, photographing, the actual analysis, because especially in a major drug bust, it serves no purpose for an investigator who has perhaps no scientific background to obtain samples, because we do not even know if it will be randomly obtained. So it makes no sense.
Thank you, General. So we were at paragraph 45, and you were dealing with Warrant Officer Perumal acknowledged that the exhibits were entered into the SAP 13, and you were at thereafter. It's the fourth line.
Yes. Thereafter, the exhibits were immediately signed out. So it means that Warrant Officer Perumal did not keep the exhibits in his safe custody. It was booked out immediately.
What does that mean, immediately?
Well, they basically, Commissioner, they basically booked in the exhibits and then booked it out immediately. So there's other columns in that register.
Simultaneously?
Simultaneously.
No, because if you know anything about this commission, you will know that immediately can mean the following month.
No, immediately
on the same day.
On the same day, at the same time and place, Commissioner.
Thank you, General. So it was immediately signed out, and then according to the officers?
According to the officers, there was not sufficient space at the Isipingo SAPS to store the exhibits. According to Warrant Officer Perumal, no inquiry was made with him regarding capacity to store the exhibits in the armory at Isipingo SAPS. According to Colonel Jacob, Brigadier Campbell Newswa gave an instruction to take the cocaine to Port Shepstone for storage after consulting Major General Sonona, Provincial Head of DPCI KZN.
Before you proceed, General, who's Brigadier Campbell Newswa?
Brigadier Newswa is the Provincial Commander for Serious Organized Crime within KZN DPCI Commissioners.
That was a position that you held at Northwest before.
That's correct, Commissioners.
Be reporting to?
By then, you would have been reporting to Major General Sonona.
Okay. You may proceed.
The exhibits were transported to the DPCI Port Shepstone Serious Organised Crime Investigation Unit's premises for storage. Lieutenant Colonel Prinsloo, who was the unit commander of the DPCI Soki, was informed of the arrangement and allowed the strong room at the premises to be used to store the exhibits. General Senona took possession of the keys to the strong room after the exhibits were stored.
Can you just explain, Lieutenant Colonel Prinsloo, his position as, you said unit commander, but in preparation for your evidence, you said he was the acting unit commander. So who would he have been reporting to as the unit commander?
Commissioners, he would have been reporting to Brigadier Newswa as a direct line of command, as the Brigadier was or is in command of serious organized crime investigation.
And then you say General Senona took possession of the keys to the strong room after the exhibits were stored. Can you just explain that process? How does it work? The keys, where's the keys ordinarily kept?
Commissioners, it's in fact a very simple process, but the key holder, obviously when you take over a SAP 13 facility, you need to obviously conduct a proper audit of all the exhibits there. Under the circumstances here, all the other exhibits or articles were removed from the safe, but there needs to be a proper handing over of that facility then, obviously, as well as the key or keys to the SAP 13 or the vault.
And these keys are the keys to where the cocaine was going to be stored?
That's correct, Commissioners.
And routinely, who keeps that key? Is it, because General Senona at that stage was the provincial head of DPCI. So this seems to me to be an operational matter, the keeping of the keys.
Commissioners, in practice, it is the SAP 13 custodian that will maintain the command and control over a SAP 13 facility. By no means the provincial head.
That was my follow-up question. Who was actually responsible for the custody of this consignment of drugs? And at what point did it move from SAPS to the DPCI? Because my understanding is that if it had been at the Isipingo SAPS, SAPS would have been responsible for that. So how does it work when it then moves to the Port Shepstone warehouse of the DPCI? And who then becomes responsible? Is it still SAPS or is it now DPCI? Understanding that they are all part of SAPS, but they are just different units.
Yeah, Commissioners, thank you for that question. Obviously, if the exhibits were left at Isipingo after it was booked in, it would have been the responsibility of the station commander and obviously the SAP 13 clerk to ensure that the exhibits are kept behind lock and key. The moment the DPCI booked it in and booked it out immediately, they assumed responsibility for that exhibits.
But could DPCI do that?
That's correct, Commissioner. There is provisions in the national instructions that the DPCI is having authority to have separate SAP 13 facilities. By nature of our work, obviously, all exhibits cannot necessarily be immediately entered at the police station due to the sensitivity of investigations.
So you are satisfied that these exhibits were lawfully removed from Isipingo SAPS?
It's lawfully removed indeed, Commissioner.
Thank you.
General, as I think you call him the key holder. In this case, General Senona became the key holder. did I understand you correctly to say ordinarily a key holder would have had to satisfy themselves about what is in that in that space for which they are holding a key? So it's not simply a matter of it's sufficient to just take the key. You know there's that and you keep the key, but you have to be satisfied that what's in there is what they tell you has been put in that room. Is that how it works?
That's correct, Commissioner. You understand me 100% correct. It means that the general was supposed to satisfy him of the contents that's being placed in that vault before he assumed responsibility for the content as well as for the keys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. General, do you know whether General Sonona was present when the drugs were put into the strong room?
That's correct, Commissioners. General Sonona was present at Port Shepstone when the exhibits were placed in the SAP 13 facility or the vault.
And can I just understand more about the possession of the keys? If you want to then access, if any of the investigating officers need to access the exhibits for whatever reason, how do they access it? And would they have to inform the key holder that they want to gain access?
In practice, Commissioners, the SAP 13 clerk or the custodian is the only person who is allowed to open that vault and to lock it again, because that maintains obviously chain of custody and ensure that if anything goes wrong, there's for instance exhibits missing from that safe, that SAP 13 responsible person will have to account for it.
Thank you, General. Then at paragraph 47.
On 23 June 2021, the officers sealed the exhibits with the assistance of Port Shepstone personnel. On 24 June 2021, the officers retrieved samples from the exhibits in Port Shepstone and forwarded the samples to FSL for analysis. So the officers that's referred to here, Commissioners, is indeed Lieutenant Colonel Sabia, Warrant Officer Mpangase, as well as other officials from Port Shepstone that assisted with the process.
Now, they accessed 23 and 24 June. How did they access it?
Commissioners, according to the statements and reports in the case docket, Major General Sonona provided the key to Warrant Officer Mpangase to gain access into the vault and to perform the duties to seal the exhibits and then to go back and obtain samples of it.
He gave the key, he didn't attend the premises to ensure that they are doing what they supposed or what they intended to do.
That's correct, Commissioners.
Now, let's deal with the 23 June 2021, the sealing of the exhibits at the Port Shepstone premises. We know that it was already booked into the SAP 13 at Isipingo, and now you have the exhibits being sealed. What's the purpose of the sealing at that stage? What are they doing at that stage? Are they putting it into the non-tamper evidence bags?
That's correct, Commissioner. Basically, the exhibits is then placed in the bags and then sealed. But it's ex post facto. It was supposed to be done at the crime scene.
And then on the...
and the opening and closing of the storage facility, did that accord with what you told us not so long ago? You said only, you mentioned the job title.
The custodian of the SAP 13, Commissioners.
Only that person can open and close. And this time you say it was Officer Mpangase who did.
That opened.
Yes. Did that accord with the process or procedure you told us?
By no means, Chairperson.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Ordinarily, would there be a record of the key being given to the custodian of the key opening, Mpangase getting in, whatever, and when I say Mpangase, it's just a placeholder, could be anybody, getting in, doing the sealing, then completing the job. Is all of that supposed to be recorded? And in this case, was it recorded?
Commissioners, the register makes provision for obviously the booking in and booking out of exhibits. So here, obviously, the whole process was upside down, to say the least. And it was never supposed to happen like that. So if General Sonona had proper control over the key, he was supposed to open that safe and not provide the key to anybody under his command to go into that facility, because he will never be able to account for what transpired there in his absence.
I think the question is also a different one, is in the normal course, would the custodian have a register of every person that had entered the strong room or asked him for access to the key, so that there's a record of who went into the strong room?
Not necessarily, Commissioners, because the only reason why an investigator will go back to an SAP 13 will be to book out the exhibits that was previously booked in and to take it to the Forensic Science Laboratory and then obviously sign for it in the register. So there's no specific provision for investigators to go into that type of facilities. There will be no proper explanation for that, except for booking out exhibits.
Because unless an investigator, such as, let's say, Mpangase, he puts it in his diary or in his book where he says, I got in at this time, this is what I did, and that would be the record. Otherwise, there's no provision for him getting in and doing the work that he ended up doing in there.
That's correct, Commissioners. It was supposed to be recorded in a pocketbook.
Thank you.
Then, General, can we deal with the other entry on paragraph 47, which is the 24 June 2021, that the officers then retrieve samples of the exhibits and forward the samples to FSL. So at this stage, the exhibits are in the non-tamper sealed evidence bags. They open the bags and they take a sample. What is your view on that process?
Commissioners, first and foremost, there was no need to go and obtain samples of that bricks of cocaine, because the whole consignment, as with all other previous consignments, was supposed to be sent to the Forensic Science Laboratory. There was no need to obtain samples. As I've testified earlier, investigators are not scientists. We do not have knowledge about random sampling for that process to be correctly performed, to enable forensic science to conduct their work effectively and efficiently so. So it does not make sense to me why the colleagues went back to that facility to obtain samples.
And do you know whether they actually did obtain the samples and send it to FSL?
That's correct, Commissioners. According to the evidence, indeed, there were samples taken and submitted to the Forensic Science Laboratory.
And was there any explanation given by FSL as to why the request was made for the samples? Because according to it says that they forwarded the samples to FSL for analysis. So FSL presumably would have requested the sample, or are they doing it of their own initiative?
I'm not sure of the details in relation to that, Commissioners, but I can follow up on that.
Now, if all the exhibits were supposed to go to the FSL, can you think of any reason why samples would be taken beforehand and a day or actually 2 days after the seizure?
Commissioners, from all the other inquiries of similar seizures that I've read and perused, this is the only matter where such samples were obtained. So I find it extremely strange why it would have been done differently now. The only conclusion I can come to is that it was never the intention to take this whole batch of exhibits to the Forensic Science Laboratory.
In other words, it was never the intention for the 541
The
kilograms.
541 bricks. I'm referring to the totality of it, Commissioners.
Thank you, General. Then, General, there's a subtopic, procedural failings during the search and seizure operation, paragraph 48.
In drug bust cases, the presence of drugs within a shipment does not in itself establish knowledge on the part of persons associated with that shipment. Thus, evidence collected at the crime scene is crucial, especially physical evidence in the form of fingerprints and DNA from the bricks and the container seal and the wrapping used to wrap the drugs. If this evidence is not collected or collected incorrectly, the already slim chance of identifying the perpetrators is made all the more unlikely.
General, can we just deal with the first part, the slim chance? How successful are you in actually finding the perpetrators of consignment, these kind of trafficking?
Commissioners, not that successful, especially in cases where the rip-on, rip-off method is being utilized due to the fact that these crimes are committed in secrecy and only the sender and the final destination obviously knows about this consignment. So there's not necessarily objective evidence that will link these perpetrators to the commission of this offense. Obviously, when circumstances differs, depending on the available evidence, that will then dictate whether there is sufficient prima facie evidence to proceed with a criminal prosecution. But especially with rip-on, rip-off methodology, it's extremely difficult to get to a prosecution stage.
Thank you. General, paragraph 49.
The officers attending to the crime scene alleged that the crime scene became busy and therefore the decision was made to process the exhibits at the Sipingo SAPS. However, the officers had to secure the integrity of the crime scene by cordoning it off. Since no photographs were taken of the location of the container and no sketch plan of the crime scene has been produced, it's difficult to verify that processing the crime scene could have been disturbed by the activity at the depot.
And before you continue, let's just understand this, the crime scene we're talking about is the container.
That's correct, Commissioners.
Okay. So can you just comment on this explanation as to why there wasn't any processing done at the crime scene and what processing ought to have been done at the crime scene?
Commissioners, first and foremost, when you logic dictate that when the doors of the container is opened and you see this bags, that's not unfamiliar to seasoned detectives, because this is the modus operandi that's applied and visible on all the photos. If I was at that crime scene, I would have closed the doors of the container, properly cordoned off the scene, and then requested the LCRC to arrive at the scene. Obviously also requested perhaps a canine dog for a further search of the area, and waited until they arrived before I proceeded with the scene. The preservation of the evidence at the crime scene is your only chance of being successful with the investigation. And therefore it's critical to make optimally use of all the possible leads, forensic leads that can be collected from that crime scene. Once that crime scene is disrupted, that possibility of gathering that evidence is gone. And you will never get the opportunity to collect fingerprint or DNA evidence from such a crime scene again. So that would have been the process that I would have followed.
Thank you.
Did you ever get to know, General, what exactly they meant by the scene becoming busy? What was the detail in that regard?
Commissioner, there was not more detail to that explanation by the officers involved there. But it's clear that we need to manage a crime scene where it is. If there's a cash in transit heist in the CBD of Tshwane, I cannot shift that crime scene because it's becoming congested with perhaps onlookers. As a police officer, it's first and foremost my responsibility to ensure that the scene is cordoned off and to prevent access of bystanders and other individuals coming to that scene. In any event, a depot is a controlled environment. It's not as if it's in the streets. It's a controlled environment. So even if it got busy with perhaps employees arriving or trucks arriving to collect containers, it's not supposed to impede with the activities that's supposed to be conducted at that crime scene.
You describe the crime scene in the way you describe it as the container itself. You would have closed up the container and the work inside. But the explanation that seems to have been given, that has been given here, suggests even outside of the container itself. So perhaps if you would just, for our understanding, give a description of what would be the perimeter, or in this kind of case, you're at the harbour, at a depot. There are other containers. There's this particular container. What is the perimeter of what you describe as a crime scene? And depending on the perimeter, is it open or at risk of people coming in and out if they are not part of the operation itself that has cordoned off the area?
Commissioners, obviously it will depend from scene to scene what's the layout. But initially the scene is confined to the container. That per se implicates that you have the scene under control. And you can decide where to set the perimeter. Because we must remember that that scene is now transferred from the container to the outside of the container, where the exhibits obviously will be opened. The LCRC personnel will conduct the necessary investigations. And you need to make it prepare that area to such an extent that it will enable you to perform your duties to the required standard. So, as I said, the scene will dictate how big that area is that you will need, and then you need to cordon it off as such. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, General.
Just so we are clear, General, the scene is the container after it has been offloaded from the ship or whatever instrument it came in. So it's not the ship itself, it is the individual container once it has been offloaded and you discover illicit drugs in it. Is that the scene?
That's correct, Commissioner. In this circumstances, obviously it's at the warehouse. So after the container was offloaded from the vessel at the docks, it is then transported to a specific container warehouse or a depot, and then from there it is disseminated further or unpacked. So that is the crime scene. It is
But
at the warehouse, which is a controlled
The
environment.
scene is not the warehouse itself, it is the container.
Indeed, initially, Commissioner, but then depending on the space that you need to effectively deal with crime scene management principles, will dictate where you set the boundaries and cordon off the area where you restrict movement of individuals.
Thank you, General. We're now at paragraph 50.
According to the protocol and the national instruction, the DPCI officers ought to have contacted a crime scene examiner from LCRC. As indicated earlier, the FSL is contacted where the crime scene is a clandestine drug laboratory. In this instance, the LCRC had to be contacted. According to the version recorded in the factual report prepared by Major General Sonona on 9 November 2021, the DPCI officer stated that they called FSL, Forensic Science Laboratory, on the standby number in order to attend the scene, but FSL stated that they could not attend because it was not a clan lab scenario. This is correct. FSL should not have been contacted. The factual report is attached to the information note prepared by Lieutenant General T.C. Mosekedi in January 22, who was the Deputy National Head of the DPCI at the time. This information note with annexures is attached and marked as HFF4.
Who was in charge of this operation at the dock when the bust was made?
It was Colonel Jacob, was the most senior officer. So obviously he assumes the responsibility and take control and command of the scene, Commissioner.
And did he have experience in crime scene management? Was it the first bust that he was involved with, to your knowledge?
By no means, Commissioner, extremely experienced. The colleague by then was the team leader for the narcotics team or the SANEP team at Durban Serious Organized Crime Investigation, and he subsequently became the commander.
Thank you.
So he's very experienced.
Thank you, General.
Thank you, Commissioner. General, we will deal with the information note as well later. Can we then deal with paragraph 51?
There is no explanation why LCRC was not contacted. The officers indicate that photographs were taken by them at the crime scene. The photographs must be taken by the LCRC crime scene examiner, who must prepare a report thereafter. No fingerprints were uplifted and no DNA collected. This would have had to be done by the LCRC crime scene examiner. Furthermore, the exhibits had to be sealed at the crime scene, but was only done after the cocaine was transported and stored in Port Shepstone.
General, based on your testimony as to how things ought to have unfolded, everything seems to have gone wrong here. Do you want to just tell us your knowledge of the expertise of the people that were involved here, the officers that were involved here? I'm just trying to understand why everything would have gone wrong. I understand you may possibly have some reluctance to comment on the expertise or lack of it of your colleagues, but the reality is, based on your testimony, everything went wrong. So
Indeed.
I'm trying to understand in my mind why that is so, or why that was so. So do you have any views as to why everything went wrong?
Chairperson, what I can perhaps provide to assist the Commission is that right from inception, when we start with our training in the college, we get exposure to how to deal with crime scenes. And whether it is a drug seizure, a major drug seizure, whether it's a murder case, whether it's a cash-in robbery incident, the principles remain the same. So whether you are experienced or inexperienced, obviously you can make mistakes as a junior member. But from the knowledge that I have is that the colleagues that were present at this crime scene under the supervision of Colonel Jacob were all experienced. There was no need for things to go wrong. And I believe further in my evidence, I will also address some of these aspects, Commissioners.
Are you aware of any disciplinary steps, assuming there's no criminal conduct on the part of the officers involved? Are you aware if, and let me not say disciplinary because that may be a wrong word, further training, steps to reinforce? And even that, Chair, I'm reluctant to use. What I'm really looking for is if there are processes in place and those processes were not followed, steps to either reinforce, in other words, train people to ensure that these things don't happen again, or if it's serious enough, then consequence management, either in the form of discipline or some other steps. Are you aware in this specific case, and we're only confining ourselves to the movement of the exhibits, not yet the storage? Are you aware that any steps were taken?
According to my knowledge, no steps were initiated, Commissioners, and I'm not aware of follow-up workshopping or training that took place to empower colleagues within that space. But training and workshopping is ongoing processes. We have a program in SAPS where colleagues of all ranks are exposed to different types of training, of which the most important perhaps for a detective is the resolving of crime, or the ROC course, where detectives are extensively exposed to the processes that needs to be followed to ensure that the integrity of crime scenes and investigations are upheld.
Thank you, Commissioners. General, can I just ask you to go back to page 16, paragraph 41? So page 16, paragraph 41, where you actually start out with the fact on the 21st of June, 2021. It says, following intelligence received on 21 June. And then it says 22 June, Lieutenant Colonel Jacob and Warrant Officer Mpangasi were contacted. Who contacted them?
Well, via the provincial offices, Captain Duma requested specifically Colonel Jacob to be part of this operation, Commissioners.
And Captain Duma is from Crime Intelligence.
That's correct, Commissioners.
And a Warrant Officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jacob and Warrant Officer Mpangasi is from DPCI.
That's correct, Commissioners.
So he requests for them to be specifically, or for Jacob, for Colonel Jacob to be specifically put on this.
That's correct, Commissioners.
And where was Colonel Jacob at the time when this request was made?
He was on leave, Commissioners, so he returned from leave to attend to this operation.
And who instructed Colonel Jacob to attend? Because
Commissioners,
surely-
I'm not 100% sure of that. I can read up on it, but it was from the provincial office that he received the directive to proceed with that investigation.
So Captain Duma from Crime Intelligence specifically asks for Colonel Jacob, but Colonel Jacob must be instructed by somebody within DPCI, of course. It can't come from Captain Duma directly.
Yeah, that's correct. Obviously, for proper governance, that's the procedure to be followed, but a police officer can place yourself on duty at any time to attend to a crime scene.
So you don't know whether Captain Dumas asked Colonel Jacobs directly, or whether he went through somebody at DPCI and requested.
I do not know if he also spoke to Colonel Jacob in person, but the directive came from the provincial office.
And when you say the provincial office, who are you referring to?
Commissioners, that's what I said. I need to just check the records to make sure of that fact. I do not want to unintentionally mislead the Commission.
But who would Colonel Jacobs' direct superior be at that time?
At that time, if he was the team leader for SANEP, then it would have been the unit commander. I do not know if there was a unit commander in Durban by then. And then obviously that will follows up to the provincial structures, who would be Brigadier Newswa as the provincial commander.
But between Brigadier Nuswa and Colonel Jacob, there would be somebody in between, presumably?
As the unit commander, if Colonel Jacob by then was not perhaps acting as the unit commander, there would have been another layer in between.
Okay, thank you. So then, General, if we can then go back to page 20 of your statement. Should I take page? Yes. Chair, moving on to another subtopic. Perhaps this would be a convenient time to take the lunch adjournment.
Let's adjourn and resume at 2 p.m.
Thank you, Chair.